Hello and welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. My name is Drew. I'm joined by my friend and co-host Alex. This week we are discussing the planned bailout that the U.S. government is using as a response to the economic downturn as a result of the coronavirus. The Dow and the S&P 500 have plunged more than 30% in the last month alone. And it's led to a lot of people to believe that we are at the beginning of a recession due to the panic over the coronavirus, as well as businesses shutting down. We're now just starting to get numbers of record unemployment applications in states like New York and California. So all this has led to a response from the federal government in the form of a planned stimulus bailout. And some are saying upwards of over $1 trillion. So we're going to be getting into, is this the appropriate response? What are the nuts and bolts of this bailout? How are other governments around the world responding to this COVID crisis? And will this be able to actually change the course and prevent a full-on recession? Alex, how you doing, man? And what are your initial thoughts?
Hey, Drew. I'm doing pretty well. It's going a little stir crazy. Like I was telling you before we started recording, I'm running out of things to do. I'm doing some remote work and trying to do some dance classes to stay active. But, there's only enough you can do in a house without leaving. So it's getting interesting. The crisis is definitely getting more and more serious in Madrid. It's kind of following suit with Italy. Not as many deaths yet, but yeah, it's been not very optimistic the last couple of weeks. I've been trying not to watch the news and just read trusted sources once in a while. So, yeah, but things are going well. And so to start off, I think it's very clear that governments are going to need to work with private corporations to create somewhat of a stimulus plan to basically just revitalize the entire economy. And I think that means individuals and corporations. And just kind of getting to the nitty gritty of it. Like you said, the Trump administration, it looks like they are aiming for something around $1 trillion. And to put that into perspective, in 2008, Nancy Pelosi had warned Barack Obama that passing a stimulus with the T word, meaning $1 trillion, would be crazy. So it's telling us, obviously, times have changed. Government is getting bigger and bigger. And I think in a crisis like this, it is going to require something up to close to $1 trillion. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I certainly think that the economy needs to be stimulated, right? I do believe that the government has a responsibility in times of crisis like this to do things to stimulate the economy and prevent a complete collapse, and especially protect the most vulnerable and the average American worker. I think that is I think there is some of this going on with the Trump's proposed $1 trillion stimulus package. One of the big headlines I think a lot of people are seeing is this, the free money thing. How Trump's plan has $500 billion to send in individual checks to individuals, right? At first it was $1,000. There's even rumors now that they're trying to go for $3,000. I mean, that's a pretty big turnaround from what people were making fun of Andrew Yang not that long ago, and now this is being proposed by the Trump administration as a main centerpiece of his stimulus package is checks to every American. I think it's a pretty radical idea. I think it might be good. I think it might generate good economic activity, but I also just find it interesting how quickly people have changed their minds on something like this. People are saying, I'm scared of socialism, and then boom, you have COVID-19, and now socialism seems to be like the general response.
Yeah, it's an interesting take on that. No, it's true. That was my first takeaway from this as well. Was wow, I bet Andrew Yang is shaking his head right now. I do think there needs to be a distinction, because Andrew Yang's policy obviously would be just an annual,
all the time
monthly
thing, yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's where we're seeing a large difference between Republicans and Democrats on some of these issues, is that I think during times of war and crisis, I think both sides agree on public spending to help the vulnerable and to help invigorate the economy. But I think there's a larger debate on
How
if some
long
of
it
those
lasts.
policies should mean, yeah, exactly, like the length and duration of these policies. And I think that's where I think socialism, I don't know if I like using the term, oh, well, we're getting into socialism now, just because this is more of a relief period when something needs to be happening and fast. And I think that's why we're seeing bipartisan support on at least passing some of these packages. Now, obviously, the details I think are going to be hard for both sides to agree on. But I think that's why you see both sides kind of throwing away their partisan economics and just realize we need to stimulate this economy and quick. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely, and it is a good thing to see some bipartisan support. Um, for the first time in a long time, I feel like because this is a crisis, and I do think that every politician understands that. In a time of a crisis, you kind of have to put some of your party politics aside, right? But also, it's in the good benefit of your party politics to handle the crisis well. You certainly don't want to be have the finger pointed at you if something goes wrong. So it's like, all right, well, let's play ball and let's help help America out. I also think Republicans understand that if they need to turn this economy around before November, or else they risk losing the White House. So they're acting quick. I think it's a good. I think the money part to especially the low income workers of America. I think that's a good thing. Where I start to have some troubles is when you start to get into things like airline bailouts. Boeing is asking for $60 billion in bailout money. And frankly, over the last 10 years, they've used $65 billion of their own money on stock buybacks. Part of the thing with like the Trump tax cuts, one of the criticisms was, it'll definitely make companies more profitable. And we saw right before this whole crisis, we were at all-time highs in the stock market. That was certainly true. And part of that was because of Trump's tax cuts. But were they using the money on research and development and expanding employee benefits? Or were they using it on stock buybacks to buy back more percentage of their own company? It was the latter. And now that they weren't prepared, prepared for a crisis. Now they're wanting a bailout. And so to me, it just seems like you used your money not wisely, and then you weren't prepared, and now you want a bailout, especially Boeing, where they've already had a plane crash. Like, it just seems like irresponsible companies are being rewarded, where the average, and I just don't think that's right.
Right. No, and I think that's a fair point, especially so for people that haven't followed it closely. Basically, the Trump administration released a 2-page memo, which was summarizing basically certain aspects of this stimulus package. And like you have said, the first two parts, involve the $500 billion centerpiece, which is giving people direct cash, which I think is going to be important for just stimulating households and the individual. And the second part, friendly skies, Trump has said that airlines would be number one. And it is interesting because the memo includes $50 billion towards keeping passenger and cargo carriers in the air, but then also Boeing is asking for another $60 billion separately, which I think is a lot to ask for in a time right now. But then, I think that's the largest criticism of this entire stimulus plan, is that it's very business friendly and less individual friendly and less protective of the individual and the vulnerable, because other aspects of the memo talk about $150 billion in aid to other severely distressed sectors of the U.S. economy. And that is very vague, which I guess could be smart, because obviously as we go down this road, I think more and more companies are going to need assistance. But also, who qualifies for this? Which companies? Do we cover all of them? I think it gets difficult, and you start looking at which corporations are the most hurt. Which is it? Do you help small businesses, every small business? Do you only help necessary industries? And it gets complicated. And then the final piece of the proposal is a $300 billion loan guarantee to help small businesses keep their entire workforce on their payroll for 8 weeks. And obviously, I think that one is smart, but I still have the issue in which a lot of these, like you said, seem to be protecting big business and corporations, which have acted carelessly. But I would take a step back a little bit, because I think that this is an issue bigger than just, for example, the airlines. I don't think it's just, buying back stocks, which have just raised the prices of them. I don't think this is just the airlines. This is a complete just financial institution wide issue as well. And there's carelessness in everywhere. And part of me thinks that I think we do need to criticize how these corporations are handling things like this. Why aren't they investing in, rainy day policies, employment policies, workers' benefits? I think that discussion needs to be had. But right now, I think we just need to get money stimulated into the economy. And the airline industry makes up more than 7% of U.S. jobs. And the industry accounts for more than 5% of the U.S.'s gross domestic product. And Boeing alone employs more than 153,000 people. So I do think we need to talk about these companies' practices, but I don't know if right now is the correct time. But what we do probably need to think about is whether Democrats should support some of this stimulus, because is it just going to help companies maintain their careless nature?
That was my point. Is I think it has to be like this money has to be with caveats of, hey, you can't use this on stock buybacks. If you do take the money, then you can't reduce your employees by a certain amount. Because my worry is Boeing gets a bit like just for the hypothetical, right? Let's say Boeing gets their $60 billion, but people are still not traveling, right? People are not going to be traveling for at least 3-4 more months at least. So they're still going to want to contract their spending. And so they probably let people go. So my worry is you bail out companies that will still end up letting thousands of people go. And so, I think this money has to come with caveats of like, you can't use it on stock buybacks. You can't like close, this many plants. You certainly can't use it on any like bonuses. I think it has to come with caveats. And to Trump's credit, he has said that, he would be against any of this money going to stock buybacks as well. It's one of these weird times where Democrats and Trump are kind of on the same page. Now that we're in this crisis, he takes that stance. I wish kind of when the whole tax cut was going on, he would mention, hey, try not to use this on stock buybacks. But we are here today, right? And so to his credit, there are multiple people on both sides asking these companies, don't use this on stock buybacks. I think it has to come with that caveat. And again, I think we're at this weird time where, I was reading this one opinion article from The Guardian. It was pretty heavy-handedly opinionated, so I didn't want to include it in like the rung of our usual stuff. But he had this one point where he got a quote from a lobbyist in D.C., and he says, anytime there's a crisis and Washington is in the middle of it, it's an opportunity for guys like me. It's almost like I don't know if you ever watched like Planet Earth, where a whale dies and it falls to the bottom of the ocean. Well, like bajillions of species come and vie for the fat. It almost feels like that right now, because the government has basically opened its doors saying we're willing to hand out $1 trillion to help this economy. Well, the way our system is set up with how special interests work is these lobbyists are going to be, scavenging and trying to pick at the fat. And so that's what's happening. That's why even cruise companies are trying to get a bailout. And many advisors have asked Trump not to bail them out because, they're not essential, right? But there's this problem of tons of special interests are trying to get a piece of this pie. And I don't think all deserve it. So we have to be very vigilant and have caveats of who we give this money to.
That's a very good point. And I full-heartedly agree with you that, I am personally in support of some form of a bailout on the airlines, just because both commercial and cargo, air travel is crucial to the economy. Like I talked about, it equates to 70% of the nation's workforce and 5% of GDP. But at the same time, I think you're right, is that we need to have restrictions. And there's positives to that. People on both the left and the right have already addressed the fact that we can't let these companies that have acted carelessly just get away with this again. It's very reminiscent, I think, of how financial institutions acted leading up to the financial crisis of 2008, right? Right. The only difference I would take from that is that this is a very weird scenario where you can't really blame any companies for their bad treatment of norms in order for this to have happened. Obviously, a pandemic is something random and it kind of throws everything off. And so in this way, I think that we need to accept that we are going to need to give money to some people that we don't want to. And it's probably going to come down to some of these companies that maybe have acted carelessly, but at this time, I don't know if we need a lot of them going under. Like The Economist has an interesting article called Flight Risk. Most airlines are running on empty. And it talks about how the airlines have been struggling for a long time. According to the International Air Transport Association, only 30 of the 120 ranked airline companies made money in 2017 and 2018. And many of these had borrowed heavily just to buy planes that are now grounded. So the airline industries are already underwater. And so I'm worried that if we don't throw at least some form of stimulus their way, it could be quite awful. And according to The Economist and to the International Air Transport Association, in January, the typical carrier had enough cash to cover between 50% and 80% of short-term liabilities, which is about 2 months of revenue. So 3/4 could not cover costs beyond 3 months, if that. So basically, they could hit some serious issues. And I think we do need to at least help keep them afloat. And this is internationally. This is not just United States or Europe. It's internationally. And China offers hope because this is still in The Economist. Its airlines are starting to take off again. In mid-February, capacity was down by 71%, but in the first week of March, it was only at 43%. So people have returned to the skies. And I think this is going to require, unfortunately, some very unpopular bailouts. But I think the elephant in the room is that we just need to make sure these companies are using the money for actual safety measures, rainy day funds, and potentially research and development and other ways to maybe move forward. But it's true that there needs to be stipulations, and I don't really know exactly how you go about that because obviously not much has changed. But I do think an interesting thing would be, this is also according to The Economist, is that the fiscal stimulus needs to be mainly influenced by the banking system. And a lot of Americans are going to say, oh my gosh, like, no, financial institutions, they've already messed up. But the best approach, in my opinion, as well, is to use the banking system because they can offer, because the U.S. government, should offer banks cheap funding to lend to their clients while guaranteeing that it will bear the most of their losses. So I think there needs to be a cooperation between banks and the government to help with these corporations. So we'll see, but that's my general idea.
I mean, the Federal Reserve interest rates are practically at zero. So, I mean, that already is happening, man, and there's incredible, like, they're injecting so much liquidity into the markets so that people can lend and create long-term business plans as cheaply as possible to stimulate growth. That's already happening, but we'll see the long-term effects. I mean, they did that. I mean, they announced that like a week ago, and the market still had a volatile red week in the end. I agree that, like, I understand that the principle, right? You lower interest rates in a time of crisis to stimulate economic growth. I think one problem was interest rates were already so low for so long that it was almost like not necessarily like the boy who cried wolf, but it was almost like it didn't have much of effect because they were already so low in the first place. You know what I mean? I think that if we had contracted interest rates longer before, kind of the more Keynesian, you lower your highs, but then you lessen your lows, I think we might have been better suited. But you're right that this is a weird scenario where it's because it's based off of a pandemic that it's not like anyone's fault. I get that, right? It's not like you can point to like mortgage lending crisis in 2008 where you can like, hey, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, you kind of messed up. This one is just like the virus, China, like, kind of just a virus. But to put in perspective how still ill-prepared some of these airlines were, the American Airlines CEO in 2017 says, we'll never lose money again. That's verbatim. He says, because of the way the airline industry has changed, which, with like extra fees on bags and smaller space, their profit was $3 billion in 2017. Which was way more than like they had in the past, where like they were making profits in the less than 100 million in the early 2000s. So so he was so confident that he said we'll never lose money again, and it just seemed like these guys were just not living in reality. You said that maybe 30 out of 120 airlines were making profit. Well, maybe the other 90 kind of knew the writing on the wall, but some of these American airlines, just it seemed like they just were totally unprepared for anything other than just crazy profits from now on, and it's just so unrealistic. I don't know. It just bothers me that some of these companies seem to be, making so much profit, but then they spend it like they're living paycheck to paycheck. I don't know. I don't know. It just doesn't. It just to me it doesn't make sense that how a CEO of a company could say something like, "We'll never lose money again."
Yeah, I think that's kind of alarming, especially just because I mean I see it in Europe when I take short distance flights all the time. I mean, the European airlines are basically a race to the bottom. It's who can cut the cost the best to make cheap travel possible for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's another side issue that's related to why the airlines were already struggling before this is just the fact that I mean, transportation is more of a necessity than a luxury, and these airlines have kind of had to jeopardize profits just to find the cheapest option, so people keep using their flights. And I think that's why they've stopped making money over the last couple of years, is because it's like a metro or a train or any of these things in Europe that they've just become just a daily usage for so many people that I think they have to kind of realize that maybe profit is not their number one priority anymore. And I mean, it's different in the United States. Airfare is more expensive. There's only like 5 or 6 companies that really run the airline market, so it could be easier to handle in the U.S. But still, you're right. It is irritating that they didn't really plan ahead. And I think most economists for years have been talking about a coming recession, of a coming end to this bull run. And it is interesting that they didn't do anything to prepare for it. But I think it kind of shows you the times we've been in. The tax cuts, what was it, the end of 2017, 2018, they, like you said, they just helped corporations raise stock prices by buying back different stocks and other options like that, and not investing in their workers. And it is an issue that needs to be addressed eventually. I just at the end of the day don't know if now is the time, because of we're in such a weird landscape. I mean, I was talking to my dad earlier today, and I mean, he's in his 70s and he's never seen something like this. I don't think any of us have seen something like this. And I just don't know if now's the time to argue about how we compensate corporations, because it's not a time for that. And I'm just torn on really how to go forward. But I think we're going to have to, unfortunately, kind of go along with what needs to be done. But I do think also that we need to target more of the individual and more of the needy, the impoverished, and the unemployed, because talking back on 2008 when the Great Recession happened, the Obama stimulus, and this is coming from Politico, included nearly $100 billion that was targeted directly at the most vulnerable victims. And a Dartmouth study estimated that every dollar spent on the poor created from $1.96 to $2.31 in economic activity. That's $1.96 and $2.31. So it was immensely important. And also he had a package that sent around $250 billion to state and local government so they could help invest in local issues as well. And that's something that I think that the Trump administration is lacking, because it is true from day one they've been pro-business.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that's where things are going to get interesting, is because you've already seen Democrats like Kirsten Gillibrand of New York say that they won't support the plan without increases in paid sick leave. And I think that is a valid point, is that we can help these corporations as much as we want, but if they're not investing in their employees, someone needs to.
Right. It's kind of like this, like it's going to have to be this balance, right? Because if you invest in only the businesses and not the employees, right, people are still going to get laid off, because they're still going to be like, people are still not traveling, not going to movies, and not buying, etc. And then if you focus only on the employees, then the employees get paid, but then businesses will go bankrupt and die. And then so even though the employee might be fine for now, they don't have a job to go back to. So I definitely agree. You have to protect the businesses. You also have to protect the workers. And then again, like you said, you also have to protect state and local governments. Everyone's going to be taking a hit by this. And what you brought up, right, is that every dollar spent on the poor created, basically twice that in economic activity. That's going to be essential. I think that definitely needs to be more focused on doing a little bit of comparison. In the UK, the UK government has decided to pay for 80% of the paycheck of people that have lost their jobs, people that are unemployed because of COVID. And I think that is a powerful way to do it. It's going to cost a lot. And again, it might be something that, they're going to have to put a limit on, right? Only for 6 months or so. But for now, it does seem like it's a radical but maybe effective way of just keeping people afloat. Now, sort of anecdotal, I know people personally that have already started to, lose their jobs or lose some opportunities because of this. Thankfully, I'm not in that position, but it certainly is. I think that we're about to see record numbers of unemployment in a rapid rate, and it's going to take something like a government saying, "Hey, okay, we'll pay 80% of your paycheck for now, so that you just, you can stay afloat." And so again, like to Trump's credit, that $500 billion that's kind of central to his plan. It's radical. It might get tied up in some weird stuff as kind of checks like that do, but in general, I do think it's a good idea. And I agree with you, right? Like, I agree with what you said earlier that we can't get all the details right. I think both sides are probably going to have to swallow their pride a little bit. And I agree, right? If I was in the position where I had to vote on things, I would probably end up, voting for whatever stimulus package was put on the floor, as opposed to, filibustering it if I didn't get what I wanted. It doesn't mean I won't be upset with some caveats, but I do agree that this is the time for quick action, and it's not going to be perfect on any sides. Thankfully, for the first time in a while, it seems like our Congress is actually somewhat willing to do the same thing. So, we'll see, but I do worry that the long-term implications of this are going to be that, again, confirming that, look, you can do when business is good, lobby for tax cuts, buy back your stocks, and when business is bad, then you can just lean on Uncle Sam. And I definitely understand that Uncle Sam has to get involved in times of crisis, but I think our system is being abused.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a very fair point. That's also an issue that kind of comes dearly to me, is that I am concerned that corporations just kind of act carte blanche when things are good, and then just know that they have the government's aid at the end of the day. And I don't think that's a good cycle. But yeah, like we've talked about, I just don't know if now is the time to force that change, because people need money quickly, and I think it is positive to see that at least there is some bipartisan cooperation on this, and I think it's just going to be what's necessary. And there's an interesting point too from, again, The Economist. I know I like The Economist here, but The Economist brings up another interesting point, is that because of how kind of volatile everything is right now, the economy and people, like, we just don't really know what's going to happen. And things need to be flexible. This is a quote from The Economist, but it says, by keeping infection rates relatively low, it leaves many people susceptible to the virus. And since COVID-19 is now so widespread within countries and around the world, the model they're using, which is the imperial model, suggests that epidemics would return within a few weeks of the restrictions being lifted. To avoid this, countries must suppress the disease each time it resurfaces. So, like, basically the point is that, yeah, these lockdown and quarantines right now, they're at least keeping the disease from spreading. But what happens when we eventually need to go back to work and get out there? All we are is people that haven't been affected, that could be potentially affected. And so I'm curious to see what happens inside of China, because obviously they haven't reported any new cases. And I wonder if that's going to hold up, because I think we need an economic plan that is extremely flexible and gets cash to households and to companies fast, efficiently, and flexible. And it's going to be really tough because of that. And I don't like it, like, again, kind of the back and forth politics. Like, you had AOC, going on and saying these bailouts for the airlines are just horrible because, they've used this money not for the worker. And I get it. I get the sentiment of that. But again, this is not the time to bring forth a need for revolutionary change. We need to do what is the number one right now, which is just getting people help. And I mean, the fiscal stimulus that they've done throughout Europe, which has been about 1% of GDP, is clearly too low. And so The Economist says that America's plan to spend about 5% is closer to the mark, which would actually help this risk. So it is good to know that at least we are coming together and trying to get together the money to actually do it. And it's going to be expensive. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, I think you're right. I think it is going to be a slap on the wrist for some of these corporations. And who knows? I mean, especially if a Biden or Bernie, I guess in some theory, got elected, they would obviously bring this up again. But I think we need to save that for the political discourse when it's actually available. And hopefully our memories will be better than last time.
Certainly. Well, and that's another aspect that it's going to be big, is the political part of it. Is, like, some of these companies will stay afloat, but some are going to go down the drain. I mean, I think companies like GameStop are not going to, they said they're closing all their stores on March 21st for the for quarantine, I don't think they're going to reopen. There's some companies that are just going to go out of business, and we're going to see a lot of unemployment. So yes, this stimulus package is a necessity right now. I think the longer term, though, I don't think this is a 1-2 month thing anymore. I think we're looking at a 6 to 8 month thing, and the results of this response to this crisis, I think, are going to make or break Trump's reelection. I really think that if we start entering into a long-term recession, he is going to be kind of blamed for the response. I mean, he says, I don't take any responsibility, but I think he should, and I think he will, whether he wants to or not. And so I think the results of these $1 trillion stimulus, I think, are kind of his gamble for reelection. This is his first big crisis. It comes at probably the worst time for him he probably could think of, and he needs to get it right, because there's going to be a lot of people out there that are going to be very desperate pretty soon, if not already.
No, I think you're right. I think it's going to be a very interesting spring into summer, and I would guess by September or October we might know if Trump's going to be reelectable or not. And basically what this stimulus plan is doing is putting two models against one another. Trickle down economics or bottom up economics.
Right.
And it's interesting because, I mean, trickle down economics has obviously been controversial and doesn't always seem to work. And as we've seen with these corporations that have, played with the extra money in terms of buybacks and bonuses. And so I'm curious to see. This is basically two schools of thought going out against each other. And I think whatever one ends up winning, or at least not winning, I'm sounding like the president here, not winning, but the one that is successful and at least helping people. I mean, if this trickle down plan of, lifting up struggling businesses doesn't work, I think that's going to be on Trump's forehead. And it's going to be very difficult for him to get support from that. So we're just really going to have to see what exactly happens here. But I mean, again, if I'm Biden or Bernie and things keep getting worse, especially if this economic plan doesn't work, I mean, it's going to be beneficial for them.
Absolutely. They're already hounding Trump on his response to the COVID-19, and why wouldn't you? I mean, it's pretty, in my opinion, it's a pretty easy, it's low-hanging fruit as far as a target, because he's handled it pretty poorly, in my opinion. I think the last thing before we get out of here I want to mention is, again, with the longer-term impacts, is the deficit. It's kind of the big elephant in the room. No one wants to recognize in the room is the U.S. federal budget deficit. 2020 was projected of already having a $1.1 trillion deficit in our spending. Now with this another $1 trillion stimulus package, and I imagine lower tax revenue because of a recession halfway through the year, I imagine our deficit will be a lot higher than our original projections. Again, deficit spending in times of crisis is normal and can be viable. I'm not arguing against that, but I do think it's going to come back around to haunt Trump if he doesn't figure out a way to lower that deficit. If he does get reelected, he's going to have to address that, because his deficit spending is kind of blowing past Obama's. And for a party that's always been really critical of deficit spending, I think it's going to be hard for him to justify years down the road. Any other last thoughts before we get out of here, Alex?
Well, yeah, the deficit, we could do a whole episode on that, but it's true. That is an elephant in the room. That's a giant-sized GOP elephant in the room at this point. And it is going to be difficult. I mean, that's a lot of money, but I mean, just to put $1 trillion into perspective, I mean, that's paying for the EPA for 120 years, or the SEC for 500 years, or 20 border walls between the U.S. and Mexico. So,
yeah,
fun fact for you there.
I mean, $1 trillion is half of what we've spent on the entire Iraq war. I mean, we spent $2.4 trillion overseas since 2001 with the overseas contingency operations. So it's like, this is half of another Iraq war in stimulus spending. It's no joke.
Right. And I mean, but the only positive about I think what Trump could do right now, if he really puts on his boots and becomes a leader, is that he's not your, typical GOP Republican, and he's managed to get the party to kind of follow him. And so maybe at this time, these big spending bills and potentially nationalizing parts of our airline industry, that's something that Republicans would never vote for. But he's led them down this direction, and maybe at this time he will actually be able to get Republicans to support high spending. So I think that's one positive out of this, is that if anyone could rally the GOP to do something that's not characteristic of them, he's the guy.
It's a very valid point, and we've seen that happen. The fact that they're about to be handing out checks to everyone in the country is definitely something I would not have expected to come out of the Republican Party. So changing times, crazy crises, and new political frontiers. All very exciting and a little bit worrisome, but we'll see what happens. Let us know your thoughts. Should companies like Boeing get a bailout? Is the crisis just too crazy to even get too muddy down with the details? How important is our stimulus package? And what are you going to do with your $1,000? I don't know if that's not confirmed yet. So, just cut me some slack. But thank you for listening, guys. This has been the Tonic Accord. And as always, we will love to hear your comments and engagement. Thank you again.